Afternoon. This is Kelly Buckley, Spectrum Financial Alliance. It's May 22nd, 2020, and had a few thoughts I wanted to share today. And the title of this event is The End of COVID-19 Restrictions, Freedom, Your Financial Future, and Memorial Day Implications. You know, we're in the midst of an economic awakening now. We literally shut down our nation's economy for the first time in our country's history. And that was driven by states, the reopening was driven by states utilizing a lot of common sense, but also by federal district court judges forcing states that were unconstitutionally restraining commerce and unconstitutionally inhibiting the free exercise of our expression, our speech, our church. So courts have gotten involved now. We're also seeing angry taxpayers get involved. People that have to pay the bill. Folks who have a lot of skin in the game because they're not government employees, which means their incomes stop when they can't work. Their benefits stop. Their retirement funds don't accrue. So, driven by courts, angry taxpayers, and common sense, we are now looking at COVID-19, coronavirus, Wuhan virus, whatever you want to call it, pretty close to being in the rearview mirror. And this will likely be the last time I discuss these elements. So I want to kind of give you some closing thoughts and maybe some lessons learned here. First, states that were the most confining to their citizens, in other words, the highest restriction, highest degree of lockdown, greatest threat of arrest if you went to the beach or opened your shop. Those states, statistics in hindsight show, have the highest per death rates or per capita death rates. And I want to show a state that's on the opposite end of that spectrum, and that's Georgia. Right here, at the peak of their curve, their governor, analyzing the data in real time, elected to begin opening their economy. Folks, that was on April 24th. And as you may be aware, Governor Kemp has received an incredible amount of derision and negative commentary from pundits and other politicians for having the courage to allow common sense in the midst of a normal pandemic, epidemic, infectious disease to have the final say. And you'll note from that peak, even though they were told, oh no, you're going to look like New York or New Jersey, they didn't. They peaked, new cases is way down, deaths are way down, and they've reopened their economy. Government employees, whether they're elected officials or just normal bureaucrats, never stopped their pay and benefits, never failed to receive their paychecks, were able to put food on the table and to make their house payments or their rent payments. I think what we can surmise from that is they were not in it with us. They did not have any skin in the game. And having skin in the game is important when you're making these kinds of decisions about people's lives, their jobs, and their futures. Maybe one thing we need to look at as taxpayers is encouraging our legislatures to stop the pay of government officials who make decisions to shut down economies, because that shutdown should affect every citizen, not just those who are not elected to office. The vast majority of the deaths that we've seen in our country are age 65 and up, normally with some type of comorbidity like asthma and diabetes, or obesity and heart disease. Let's take a look at COVID-19 deaths now in two states that were roundly criticized for opening early, Georgia first and Florida second. Let's look at those states in terms of death rates. We've got Florida down here with a per capita death rate of 0.01% from COVID-19. We have Georgia with a per capita death rate of 0.02%. And then the two states that many in our nation, many governors have tried to emulate, 0.34% per capita death rate in New York and 0.12% in New Jersey. Next slide. Vast majority of deaths, as I said, are age 65 and up, and most of those deaths are in nursing home or assisted living. I thought there was another interesting comparison, though, when I was looking at the data, and that is between the states of North Carolina, with a governor that's fairly liberal, and South Carolina, with a conservative governor. One state stayed closed for a long, long time, North Carolina. The other state began opening when the science told them they could. So when we look at their death rates, population's about twice as much cases are about twice as much in North Carolina, which makes sense because South Carolina has half their population. But you will note that their death rate, 0.01% per capita, is exactly the same. The only difference, and there's very little cultural difference, as you know, because the states are adjacent to each other. They're both coastal states. So there's not a lot of differences here other than the death rate's the same and the techniques they use to cope are vastly different. Unconstitutional government shutdowns led to unnecessary miseries for our population. We should only quarantine the vulnerable. In this case, clearly the evidence shows that that would be older people, primarily 65 and up, or those who are already compromised because of various diseases. There's a really good NIH, National Institutes of Health study that I found that looked at the 2007 to 9 recession, the so-called Great Recession. I don't think there's anything great about them. But in the Great Recession, this study showed that for every 1% increase in unemployment, there was a 1.6% increase in suicide. That is a U.S. National Institute of Health study. We have to think about things we do in terms of what the unintended consequences of those events are. I looked at a Meadows Mental Health Policy Institute study that showed that suicides, based on a 20% unemployment rate, Kentucky's is 33% now, will cause another 18,000 suicides and more than 22,000 overdose deaths. Add those together, you're at 40,000, or a little more than 40% of our total losses to COVID-19. In our state and in all 50 states, no hospitals were overwhelmed, but many hospitals had to lay off their staff, their doctors, and their nurses, including in Kentucky, and they're struggling financially now just to keep their doors open. Why? Because they were ordered, as we were in Kentucky, by their governors not to do any elective surgeries in anticipation of that which never came, a flood of COVID-19 patients. This is going to ripple through time. We're going to see community hospitals close in all likelihood. And that'll be as a direct result of these orders, ill-considered orders. State's closure of schools has also impacted our country, our state, and more importantly, our children. This has occurred despite zero evidence that there was any problem in terms of children's health from COVID-19. What we know now is they are remarkably resistant to this infection. We've had 0 deaths in Kentucky of anyone 19 and under. Why are our schools closed? And if we're being told by educators that online education is good, what does that do to our teachers? What does that do to their jobs down the line? I want to sum it up now. Quarantine the vulnerable, because this is going to happen again. And I don't just mean from the second or the third round of this infection. I don't know how many rounds of common flu we've had, but it's a bunch. I do know that normally in a typical year, 50 to 70,000 Americans, according to the CDC, lose their lives to ordinary influenza. Schools should reopen now with appropriate safeguards. Not safeguards that are so ludicrous like those released by CDC yesterday to cope with a problem that doesn't exist, and that is COVID-19 in children, which doesn't exist. Those policies that were released yesterday, I read through them pretty carefully, and they seem to be designed to keep schools closed in the fall. They're designed to make it impossible to bus students to school. Not sure why. Science does not support the policies of the CDC. But the CDC has been wrong on virtually every prediction made by their touted models. We started with 2.5 million people in our country were going to die, and we're around 100,000 now, with an infection year for flu being bad, ordinary flu normally around 70,000. Next slide. States that remained open did as well as those that shut down. Here's some examples. I'll start with Kentucky. As you can see, in terms of new cases, we do appear to have peaked. We've definitely flattened the curve. Same thing in deaths, and this is updated to the 20th. At any time in our nation's history, we need to also consider, again, that law of unintended consequences. These are states that did not lock down with their COVID deaths, and then as a percentage of their population. Here's Kentucky and the percentage, which is the highest of those states depicted. Equally importantly to me, because unemployment, we just showed statistically, leads to greater death. Equally important, Kentucky has the ignominious glory of being number one in the state, in the nation, in unemployment rate. This is shocking. And this is where Kentucky is. So these policies that put people virtually under house arrest, dictate to them that they can't travel out of state, overturned by federal court, that they can't assemble in a cautious way to worship, overturned by a federal court. These policies did not help. These policies hurt. And the problems of the unemployment at which Kentucky has peaked now in the nation, those problems will ripple through time as well. COVID-19 had little or no effect on children, but 100% of us have watched our children's educations decline, watched the frustration on their face with our grandkids or our kids when they're trying to utilize online instruction that they have had little exposure to. These are things that are lessons learned. So let me sum it up. Quarantine the vulnerable, not the healthy, like we've always done in any epidemic or pandemic situation in the past. We've never closed our economy as a result of a virus. Schools should reopen now with appropriate safeguards. And you don't destroy people's jobs, their hopes, their dreams, and their children's education to fight an infectious disease. We never have before. We never should again. Next slide, I think. And we'll just leave that one there right now. Go back one, Braden, I'm sorry. You know, we've had times in our country's history where elected leaders have utilized unconstitutional measures to control situations. And that's what we did here. Clear constitutional violations. Courts have found it all over the country, and those suits will probably be rolling through courts for a long time to come. Other excuses have been equally compelling. This one was, it's World War II. And I guess that gave politicians license to deprive us of our constitutional rights as guaranteed under our Bill of Rights. But we did that once before. We did that on the initial days and months of World War II, and we did it and laid a very ugly stain on the honor of this nation, and that was with the internment of Japanese Americans in prison camps, where many of them died in our country, primarily on the West Coast, California and Washington. And that unconstitutional decree was passed by a lionized liberal leader, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, through executive order. We imprisoned about 80% of those people who were second and third generation Americans, simply because of their ancestry. There is never an excuse for violating the Constitution of the United States. I say that clearly to our elected officials. And anytime you do, you're going to get an equally bad result. You don't destroy people's lives, their jobs, their hopes, their businesses. They fought hard for years and sometimes decades to build because of an infectious disease. And if you're going to compare it with World War II, I want to point out that in World War II, we did not hunker down and hide and defeat the enemy. We went out and confronted the enemy. We worked through the problem, and we did it at the cost of blood. But that preserved our nation, our freedom, our way of life, and gave our children hope for the future. We weren't in this together. There's another lesson learned. Government employees and elected officials did not sacrifice one day of pay while shutting our economies down and costing people many months of pay. Prediction after prediction by the Center for Disease Control was wrong. Their models were flawed and likely politically biased. We said that when we looked at the initial science that they were putting out. It's hard to draw the conclusions they drew. And that's a lesson we need to learn too. Allowing government public health officials to have the final say is a dangerous exercise that our founding fathers and mothers would never have allowed, and that's why they created the Constitution. Elected officials should be responsive to the people and not responsive solely to public health officials. Remember, we've never produced a single vaccine for AIDS, HIV, the common cold, H1N1, and I could go on. There are no vaccines for SARS. But we never even considered shutting our economy down, as has been being widely debated again if there's a resurgence. So lack of vaccine is not a reason to further destroy and impede our country's economy and ultimately our system of government and way of life. Let's talk a little bit about your financial future now. And I'm not trying to cheerlead this, and my opinions are opinions. They're not facts. But I feel strongly about what I'm getting ready to say. We're at the initial stages of an epic comeback. That comeback began on March 23rd, which our firm on April 2nd, in written messages to you, predicted would be the market low, and it was. Since that time, Spectrum Financial Alliance's client accounts, all accounts, net of all costs, according to Morningstar Inc., have appreciated 27%. I don't think the market will go up another 27% this year. I think it'll go up more, quite a bit more, probably in the high 30s. And I believe sometime in the third quarter this year, we will attain the old market highs of February. When we get into the fourth quarter, that epic recovery is going to be on a roll. It's driven by many factors, and I'll just talk about some of the drivers. But let me say first, in the fourth quarter, I think we're going to look at about a 10% plus return. Here's some of the drivers of this. $8 trillion in fiscal and monetary stimulus. That's a tsunami of cash the likes of which our country has never been exposed to. That will push equity values. Interest rates will be constrained artificially by the Federal Reserve for a lengthy period of time. Pent-up consumer demand will drive prices. I had the privilege of going out and eating lunch today at a restaurant on the first day they opened, and it was delicious. And there's a lot of people that are pent up in their demand to go out and eat, to take a vacation with their friends, their family, to buy a new car. You're going to see a lot of the sales that were lost in the second quarter of this year pushed into the third. So the net effect of this glitch event called COVID-19, this speed bump in the road, will not be much by the time we reach the end of the third quarter. Extremely low interest rates are going to remain for some time. That fuels a rapid economic expansion. Phase 2 of more regulatory reform. The President signed another executive order. They're going back to the drawing board to reduce and eliminate unnecessary federal regulation that impedes progress and impedes growth. Our trade deals, USMCA with Mexico and Canada, and the China trade deal kick in June. They will have huge effects on jobs and income and economic growth in our country. Then there's going to be a recalibration by analysts and economists who truly, like the CDC, appear to have gotten it all wrong, all of it. They imagined that our economy would stay closed through the end of the year, or at least into the fall, like they're still trying to close schools. Those imaginings are going to hit a hard wall of reality very shortly, because the rush to the exits is on, remember, from restrictions driven by lawsuits, federal court decisions, and really angry taxpayers who have the common sense and the discipline to utilize social distancing, or if they need to, a mask, and determine when it's appropriate for them to go to their houses of worship. Relaxed government regulations, I've already mentioned. Factories and jobs are the next factor. We have hundreds, I predict, of factories and tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, of jobs that will relocate from China and the vicinity of China over the next few years. I'd say the bulk of them over the next year. We have to gain control of our supply lines, pharmaceutical supplies, and strategic defense items, precious metals, that in many, many cases we literally shipped over to other countries. Remember, China threatened us in the midst of this to cut off vitally needed drugs that they control. And then portfolio bias is a big reason for what you're going to see to come. Our portfolio now and through this last 2 months has become oriented towards this economic reopening that we predicted and believed would happen much, much quicker than pundits and analysts believed. Last but not least, for clients who have noticed for a while, you know that in September of 2016, I predicted that because of the Electoral College, President Trump would be elected. And he was. And it wasn't by a small margin electorally. I'm going to go ahead and tell you today, I've analyzed that data again, and it's our firm belief that President Trump will be reelected by a larger margin, in all likelihood, than in his first term. What this means for Americans is it means consistency in policy. It means that Democrat hopes of swinging the economy to a more socialistic regime will not come to pass, and they shouldn't come to pass. World history is clear on this point, Ocasio-Cortez. Socialist republics don't grow very fast. Democracy and economic growth produce much faster rates of growth, much higher national income, much higher per capita or worker income. As you see from this chart, this is a depiction that basically shows from repressed to mostly unfree to moderately free, mostly free, and free countries per capita income. And then we plot those countries by their freedom index versus that income. And what we'll find is the freer a country is, the higher its income becomes. This has always been true. People thrive in freedom, not government oppression. If the government was the solution to our problems, the VA would be an efficiently run healthcare system. The post office would be able to work without being bankrupt every 5 years and requiring bailouts. Government is not efficient. And my liberal friends believe that it leads to solutions. I think solutions come from the people who were empowered by the Declaration of Independence and our Constitution to take control in their own hands, individual hands. Individual accomplishment drives group accomplishment, not the other way around. Anyone that's had a sociology course can tell you that's true. There have been many, many studies of this. So we mustn't provide disincentives to get our economy back on track. That means you should make 2 and 3 times as much on unemployment as you made from employment. That's a problem that I believe will get corrected fairly shortly by our Congress. So let's talk about Freedom and Memorial Day now. We talked about free countries have higher economic growth. Free countries have higher standards of living, higher educational attainment, etc. These things are universally true. Politicians, remember, compared COVID to World War II. Bad comparison. Because if we'd hunkered down in the trenches in World War II, we'd all be saying Sieg Heil and praying to the Emperor of Japan right now. We didn't do that. We fought the battle. This has not been a fought battle. It's been a battle quit on. It's been a battle with bad science and horrible medical advice from the CDC. I think history will show these things very, very clearly. Calling an infectious disease a war, that's wrong. It was just an infectious disease that was more virile. It had higher transmissibility than other infectious diseases. But it was just an infectious disease. There are no exceptions to this rule that I'm about to talk about. No politician can deprive you of your constitutional rights, including the right to work. No politician can imprison you without due process, meaning house arrest, the virtual house arrest we've been on. So, in closing, this is Memorial Day weekend, and we hope and pray that your Memorial Day is wonderful and happy in a time with friends and getting together again with those you love. But please remember what Memorial Day is about. It ties right back in to your investments in the economy. Memorial Day is about hundreds of thousands and millions of Americans who gave everything, every tomorrow, for us. We need to remember their sacrifice. And because they were willing to give everything for us, we have to stand up for our freedoms. We can't allow politicians to take our rights from us without due process. So please remember the sacrifice that men and women have made for this country for hundreds of years. And don't allow us to be the first generations that allowed those freedoms to slip away forever. And with that, we want to open it up for questions. If anyone has questions, if you would rather not voice them publicly, you can send us an email or you can call the office at 859-223-6333, and we'll be glad to answer those questions at this time.
We can also send them
Also, Haley just mentioned to me, if you would like a copy of our outline for your own review, we'd be happy to email that to you. So please let us know.
No questions.
Anything else? Okay. All right. I want to say have a wonderful weekend. Happy Memorial Day, and God bless all of you.